So when you have a Spring application and you try to access some URL or some mapping or some path that is not defined in your controller, you usually get this message. Now, before I go on and show you how to customize this and return our error message, I'm gonna have to explain to you how this happens. So when you go to this URL that doesn't exist, obviously this is an exception, right? There's a problem, and we all know that this is a 404 because the page that you're trying to access doesn't exist, right? Now the thing with Spring is Spring has a class that is looking at this, right? It's a handler, and it captured this request and say, hey, there's no mapping for this. So instead of throwing some exception, Spring has a way to actually handle this. So Spring just do the handling for us and then return this HTML page, right? So there are two ways we can actually customize this. The first way is to actually make Spring throw the exception, and then we can catch the exception the same way that we've been catching exceptions. So we would go into our handler and then put that exception name in the at handler exception handler annotation, and then we'll be able to capture this, right? So that's the first way. The second way we can do this is to actually create a mapper for this, because there's a way you can actually override the mapping for this request, right? So this is actually mapping to /error, so it's mapping to something like this, right? So we can actually either make Spring throw the no handler for this request when it can't find a page, or we can override this mapping, which is eventually what causes this page to come here. So I'm gonna show you the first way, and then I'm gonna show you the second way to do this, and then I'll tell you which one of them I think is better in my opinion, and I'll tell you why I think it's better. So again, to start with the first way, which is to force Spring to actually throw the exception to say, hey, I couldn't find a handler for whatever URL we had here, which is like some random stuff like this, right? So there's an exception that is supposed to be thrown by Spring. It's actually thrown by Spring, but Spring just handle that exception. So we just want to tell Spring, do not handle this exception, and then we're gonna catch this exception ourselves. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we have to do, I'm gonna minimize this for a second. So there's a class called resource HTTP request handler, right? So if you click on or type on shift 3 times, this is gonna come up, and you can search pretty much anything in IntelliJ. So let's search for resource HTTP request handler. Yeah, so there it is. Okay, so this class is a bean is created for this class whenever Spring starts, right? Unless you put configuration to exclude this bean is going to be created. So we can actually create a configuration to actually exclude this class altogether, right? But as you can see, this class is doing a lot of things. It's not just one thing. It's checking for a lot of things, right? So this class is the class that its bean get created whenever the application starts, and it's handling requests, right? When there is no handler, right? And eventually what ended up happening is whenever the dispatcher servlet see that there's no path for a specific URL, instead of just throwing the no handler found exception, well, it actually throw the no handler found exception, but this resource HTTP request handler catches it and then throw the page that we saw, which is this page right here, right? So that's what's happening here. So all we have to do is to tell Spring to actually throw the exception instead of having their own default configuration catching it, and then we're gonna catch it ourselves. So let's go back here, right? We can go to the property file, and let's go to project, and here's our property file. And we can put a configuration here to turn that thing off. So under Spring, we're gonna put another configuration. So we're gonna do, right? So we're gonna go into a new line, and I'm gonna backspace 1, 2, 3, right? So right now, you can see under this line all the way up, we're actually under Spring, right? So under Spring, I can access MVC, and then here I'm gonna access the throw exception if no handler found. You see, by default it sets to false, and I want to set it to true, right? So I'm saying, hey, if you can't find any handler, just don't handle it by yourself, just throw the exception, right? So this is what I'm doing here. And then I also want to say for under MVC, for any resource, right, I want to do add mapping to false. So let's do add and slash mapping to false. So essentially what these 4 lines are doing is just configuring the servlet to throw the exception if no handler is found, which is the exception is actually called no handler found, right? And then after that, it's also going to tell Spring Boot not to register the handler, right? So that's what we're doing here. So at this point, whenever we go to some URL that doesn't exist, instead of handling the error itself, Spring, it's just going to actually throw the exception. So this is what this 4 lines are doing. So now that we know this is not going to happen, right? It's not going to handle the exception by itself. It's actually going to just throw the exception like it would for some other cases. So now we can go back into our handler, and then we can catch this specific exception, which is actually no handler found exception, because whenever we try to access this page, right, it couldn't find anything to handle the actual request because there is no mapping for it. So let's go back here, and then we can just copy this, and I'm just gonna paste it here. And then here, all I have to do is to change this to no handler found exception. So I'm gonna do no handler found exception. So this is the exception that gets thrown eventually when there is no handler that is found. So I can just pass it here like this. I don't actually need the exception, so I'm not gonna do anything with it, but I'm just showing you can pass it here. And then here I'm gonna just delete this too, and I'm just gonna delete this one line, and then I'm gonna say this is about a request, right? And then I'm just gonna pass a simple message to say this page was not found, right? I can do something like that. So this is gonna do exactly the same thing we've been doing with everything else here, because in the configuration, I'm telling Spring to actually, if you don't find any handler, meaning if you don't find anything to handle the URL, just throw the exception. Don't handle the exception yourself. Just throw it. And then I'm telling it to actually not, for Spring Boot not to register the resource handler. And this is not just doing just that. This is disabling a lot of things, and this is why I'm gonna tell you that this method is not the, at least in my opinion, the preferred method. So now if we restart the application and we try to access some page that doesn't exist, we should actually see this response coming back to us, right? This is gonna be no handler found exception, and it's gonna return our custom response to the user. So application is gonna come up, and we're gonna go ahead and try that again. Okay, so the application is up. Let's go ahead and try that. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. As you can see, this page was not found. Okay, so it's never gonna show us this white label error anymore. It's just gonna show us this. And another thing I wanted to show you, if you actually wanna see exactly where this page error is coming from, let's see, it's oops, I didn't mean to do that. So let's do I think it's called error MVC auto configuration. I think it's this one. So error MVC auto configuration, yeah. So if you look here, ultimately this is gonna end up being called. And if we go down to, let's see here, so this method right here is gonna end up being called when Spring handle the no handler found exception for us. And as you can see, it's exactly just putting all the HTML together. So, this application has no explicit mapping for blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm sure you're used to that message if you've been using Spring for a while. So we're going to stop it from actually handling the exception ourselves with this configuration. And then we're just going to handle the exception like we just did here. And we're sending our exact message, which is here. Whenever we go to some random path, in this path there's no like controller to actually handle it. Okay, so that's the first way to do this. Now, the reason I don't prefer this way is because if you go back into the application and you go into the resource handler, you can see that it's doing a lot of things. See, so there's like different things that can happen in the application, and it's gonna throw different error message and things like that. So I don't want to just disable this entire class and have it not throw this exception. So I don't want to miss something, like if I'm debugging or anything, unless I'm really like sure exactly what I'm looking for, then I can be very particular about what I'm disabling or not. But I don't want to disable this entire class just for that one white label page, right? So that's why I don't prefer this, unless like I'm very specific to what I'm doing, and then I'm gonna probably have to add in like multiple configuration to say, hey, enable this but disable that and things like that. You can do it this way if you really don't care about this, you just want to handle everything yourself, but you just have to know exactly what you're doing, because this is doing not just one thing, it's doing a lot of things. Okay, there's different things that can happen. So the other way, like I explained, is to just map this this error URL, which ultimately gets sent back to the servlet, and then the server is going to send the response. Okay, so the way to do this is actually easier. So let's go back to the configuration, and I'm just gonna comment those out because I don't need them right now. And by the way, there's one last thing I want to show you. So if I disable this and restart the application, right? So I'm gonna restart the application, and the application is up. So let's go back here and try it again. You'll see we get it again because Spring is handling it for us. Now, what I wanted to show you is if you just want to disable the Spring configuration and let the servlet send you the response, you can actually do that, which is it can be useful, but most of the time people just ignore this. So you can add another configuration in the actual server, and the configuration is going to be very simple. So you're just going to say error, and you're gonna say white label, which is the error that we're talking about, and then we're gonna do enabled, and we're gonna set this to false. Okay, so if we set it to false, it's not gonna send the actual this actual page back to us. It's actually gonna let the servlet handle this exception instead of handle it. This is Spring handling this, giving us this nice page. So I'm gonna restart the application, and then I'm going to show you how it's going to look when we disable this and we let the servlet actually handle the 404 not found. So it's going to restart and let the application come back up. So the application is back up. Let's go back to the browser and refresh. And you can see we're getting the actual 404 from the servlet because it couldn't find anything else. Okay, so I'm showing you all the tricks. If you want to do this, if you just want the servlet to send you the error message, and then you can from there maybe override it from the servlet, you can actually do that too. So now I don't necessarily need this. I'm just gonna comment this out, but I'm gonna leave this code in the file itself so you can have access to those and you can take a look at them whenever you want. Okay, so my preferred way to handle this exception, I'm gonna restart this just so we don't waste time when we need to test again. So my preferred way to handle this exception is to actually override the path that gets called whenever this page gets displayed. Okay, so what we're gonna do now, I'm gonna minimize this. We're gonna have to go to the handler. So let's go into the handler, right? So I don't really need this anymore, so I'm just gonna comment it out because I'm not using it. But I'm gonna leave it there, and you guys can take a look at it. So what I want to do now, I want to override the actual method that returns the path to the error. And that's what, that's what gets actually ultimately called to actually show the page. And I just want to override this method to send a different URL. And from that URL, I can actually send the response that I want. So I need to implement the interface. So let's do implement, and that's going to be the error controller. Okay, and this is coming from Spring. So if you go into that, right, and you can see it's a functional interface, and it's only has one method, which is get error path. Right, this is returning /error, which ultimately send the actual white label error page that we see. So if we can override this message to return a different URL, which is like a different path, and then from this path we can actually return a response or whatever response that we want, that would be like the best way to do this. Okay, one of the best way to do it. So here I'm just gonna go implement method, and you can see that's the functional interface method because it's only one method in here, and here it is at the bottom. Now I'm gonna put in this path, the path that gets called. So I'm gonna do public static final string. Oops, let's try this again. So public static final string, which is this one, and that's gonna be the error path. So I'm gonna call it error underscore paths, and it's gonna equal to error, right? Because that's what it is. So /error. Oops, it's supposed to be lowercase /error. Okay, so this is the actual path that gets ultimately called. So what I can do now, I can take this path, right, and I can just go down and I say return this path, right? This is the method that I'm overriding, and I say return this path. And then here I can just have a method that takes this path and then return some response like this. Okay, so let's copy this method, and I'm just gonna go down here. I'm just gonna paste it here. So we don't need the handler because we're not handling anything, but here we need a request mapping. So I'm gonna do add request mapping. So request mapping, and all I have to take here is this path, right? So for this mapping, I'm taking this path, so here. Okay, and then I want to return an HTTP response of this, and I'm just gonna say page not, well, it's not page because this is a this is a REST controller, so I'm not looking for a page. I'm actually making a RESTful request. So let's say not found 404, for instance, right? So you can name this whatever you want. So it's really not gonna take anything, and here I can just return whatever I want. Okay, so I know that if it's a not found, so it's gonna be this. So I'm gonna place it in here, and then here I can pass in whatever message that I want. So I can say something like the page, or page was not found, something like that. Okay, so the page was not found, or I can say there's no mapping. There is no mapping for this URL. Okay, something like that. URL. Okay, so mapping. I can do something like that. Okay, so what Spring is gonna do is gonna try to find, well, it's gonna see, if I scroll up a little bit, it's gonna see that I'm overriding this. So instead of calling the default method, which is this method right here from this interface, it's gonna call mine because I'm overriding it here. And then it's gonna say, hey, just return this path, right? Which is the actual error path, right? And then from here, it's gonna say, oh, but I actually have a method that can actually handle this path, which is this one. And then it's just gonna return this response to the actual browser or the user. And this is gonna create our, nice JSON response, standard response in the actual API. And that's exactly what we want. But there's one last thing I want to do. If I try to test this out right now, it won't work. There's one last thing I have to do, and the reason I have to do that is because this right here is mapping from the actual URL itself. And what I mean by that is this is expecting something like this. So if I go back to just copy this and then go back to the application, so this is expecting something like this. something like this. It's gonna be something like this. Okay, so it's gonna be like, whatever the domain is, and then /error, right? Which is what this is. Now, as you can see, if we go back to the resource where all the requests are gonna be coming in, you can see that I'm overriding the base URL. So what that means is that ultimately I will never actually have this when the application is gonna start looking for it, because it's gonna do something like this. It's gonna just do user / okay, so, and that's not going to work for us because we're actually mapping to this. Okay, so we have to fix that. So the way to fix that is very simple. All we have to do is to go into the resource. Actually, I'm going to set this to path just to be more specific. And if we go to the resource, instead of overriding just the base URL with user, we can actually leave the default. So here we can just put curly braces. We're gonna pass more than one value, and we're gonna say, hey, don't just override this the base URL with /user. Also, just leave the actual basic URL, which is just /. Okay, so that way it can actually map it starting from here, because either if I go from user or if I go from here, it will still work. Okay, so at this point, if we try to run the application and we try to go to some URL like this that's not defined, it should also return us the actual message that we just defined in the handler, which is, if we scroll down, which is this. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that. I'm going to restart the application and check it in the browser. So let the application come up. So the application is up. Let's open up the browser and check this out. Refresh. And as you can see, we get our message. There's no mapping for this URL, which I specified here. There's no mapping for this URL. So I think this is a cleaner way to handle this white label default message that we get when you try to access a path that doesn't exist. If you try to like disable the entire handler, you're gonna have to be very specific, and I think it's gonna be a little bit complicated if you just try to stop it for that specific handler, because this is gonna try to handle a lot of things, like if you use this route. Okay, so I think it's a little bit cleaner and easier as well to actually handle this exception that way, so that you don't disrupt in all the other beans that Spring is creating by default, unless you really like know exactly what you're doing and maybe you have a security concern or something like that, and then you're very particular about your configuration. But otherwise, I would just go with this route. Okay, so as you can see now, we will never get this, this white label error message anymore. Anytime that happens, it will throw our actual exception. So I hope that was useful to you. And again, there's a lot going on with this. Really, I'm just really going really fast with this, but there's like way more going on. Like if you look into this class, for instance, there's just a lot going on, and there's more that I can tell you. Like I can show you exactly where this configuration is, like this in the code, not in the configuration. It's actually in one of those class, and it's set to false all the time. And you can also, do this in a programmatic way. Instead of using this configuration, you can create another configuration in the application and then set those values and disable things and things like that. But I think this is a very, very nice and clean way to handle this white label error default that we get with Spring.